Ladies and gentlemen, from my side, a warm welcome to our first web conference this year. A somewhat thrilling geopolitical year 2022 lies behind us. But it was also a year that raised such questions as energy security, profitability, reliability, and also delivery capabilities. This was certainly a special year, but we finished this year successfully. And that's what we see in the key financial figures I want to show you here. Turnover is a whopping 17% above the previous year and thus slightly, meaning 1 percentage point, above the upper edge of our own guideline. This overfulfillment came at the last moment of the financial year. You may remember from mid-November onwards, we had weeks of cloudy and misty autumn and winter weather, at least in Germany. So no wind, no sun, and higher gas prices on top of that. As a result, we saw high electricity prices. Perfect weather for 2G. This constellation then leads to customers sometimes making considerable efforts to get their CHP systems connected to the grid after all. Because when electricity prices are high, every day counts. As we look further to the total output, this even increased by 26% to 339 million euros. In the second half of the year, without the lockdown and with considerably less disruptions in logistics, the production at our factory went really fine. Yes, and this is reflected in the output, which is 70 million euros higher than in previous years. EBIT increased by a nice 4 million euros or 23%. Only liquidity is declining, but the reason can already be seen on this page. A production that is about 26 million euros higher than turnover naturally leads to a build-up of stocks of finished products. That costs liquidity. But the liquidity still stands at a comfortable amount of 13.5 million euros. As always, we have two different perspectives on our turnover development. First, there's the breakdown of turnover into the new machines business, the so-called CHP units, here in dark green, and into service and spare parts here in light green. As I said, the total turnover grew by a nice 17%. The segment of CHP sales finally grew again, actually by 9%. Last year, we had to struggle with stagnating machine sales. However, it must also be said that our home market was really restrained, at least in the second half of the year. Keywords that influenced our customers here were feared gas shortages. This affected natural gas users and especially in Germany, the discussion about an excess profit taxation in the energy sector, which would also affect biogas operators. And the result, machine sales in Germany reached 83 million euros after 82 million euros in the previous years. In contrast, the Benelux countries have made a real gain. Here, sales grew by almost 12 million euros to now around 15 million euros. And we believe there's more to do. Much more. That's why we have established a sales and service subsidiary in the Netherlands in January this year. Although the Benelux states are a highly competitive terrain, they are also a region with really high potentials. And the second really interesting region for sales of machines was also in Europe. In some of our eastern neighbor states, the old dogma of coal-fired power generation is finally breaking down. Central Eastern Europe makes a very significant contribution to growth in Europe outside Germany. Overall, our sales in those European countries outside Germany increased with 20 million euros by a good 50%. The service segment is also growing significantly by a whopping 28% and now accounts for 47% of total revenues. In absolute terms, the increase here was 32.5 million euros. Of this 32.5 million euros, the full consolidation of Senatec Center GmbH in Schweinfurt, Germany accounts for only 2.6 million euros. So without this new subsidiary, total service revenue would still have grown by a good 25%. Here we also see the same development as at machine sales. The European countries outside Germany making a very respectable contribution to growth with 7 million euros. But the lion's share comes from Germany, where service is growing by 23 million euros. The second perspective on our turnover and turnover development is, as always, the domestic sales versus export. You can see this relation here. The export ratio continues to rise to now 40%. The German market increased by 15% or by 23.7 million euros to now 186.3 million euros. As I just said, this increase comes almost exclusively from service. The business abroad grew by 22% or just under 23 million euros. Last year, I pointed out that the export business exceeded 100 million euro mark for the first time in our history. This year, we are already at an impressive 126.3 million euros. Let us now turn to the income statement. The turnover increased, as already mentioned, by 17%. The factory has been in top form during the year. The total output is up by 26%. It is now actually 70 million euros higher than the previous years. This output exceeds sales revenues by 26 million euros and leads to inventory increases. And since we have, of course, not increased the work in progress in the factory to such extent, it can be assumed that the vast majority of stocks are in the form of virtually finished CHPs shortly before they will be booked as turnover. In other words, from this inventory increase alone, we could serve the sales we had realized in Q1 2022. That was 48.7 million euros, including even the service revenues. Because, as you know, virtually all finished CHP that we have on our balance sheet have been sold, paid for, and in some cases are already physically at the customer's yard. That's the reason why we think that the current Q1 will be a very good quarter, at least in terms of CHP turnover. So, let's take a quick look at other operating income. This increased by 1 million euros for one particular reason. We got payments from various parties that we did not expect it and which we consequently did write off in previous year. Among them was an incoming payment from Ukraine in the amount of 60,000 euros, just for curiosity reasons. But as you see here, the operating income reflects only the EBIT effective ones. This is because we released the UK provision this year. As you will recall, we recognized this provision of 1.8 million euros in 2017 in connection with a VAT issue relating to the supply of machinery to the UK. However, the provision was below EBIT. After some not really extensive communication with the UK tax authorities, this process has now been sleeping for several years. Therefore, we decided, or better, it was necessary to determine the non-existence of the risk and then also consequently release the provision, but then again below EBIT. So let's take a look at the material cost. Material cost, or rather increase in material costs, were a hot topic in the past year. As to G, we have also seen incredible price increases. However, we have tried to pass on this cost pressure to our customers by adjusting list prices. In principle, we have succeeded in doing so, but certainly not always with perfectly matching deadlines. In other words, we have, considering the entire situation, been close to the reality with our price increases, but for sure, we haven't been in front of the wave, but probably mainly behind it. The ratio of cost of materials to total output increased by 2.4 percentage points to definitely um, stand now as an important and substantial figure. However, there are two aspects to the overall assessment of this ratio. First, as the service segment has continued to rise, the cost of material ratio should actually have fallen because service is more personnel heavy than material heavy. Second, to have a comparable overall performance, you should have the change in stock on equal level. So assuming that the change in inventory has been fully turned into a turnover in both years. In such case, total output would increase by the generated margin, resulting in a noticeable decrease in the materials ratio in 2022, and it would remain almost the same for 2021 because the change in inventories in 2021 was of minor importance. Against this background, it can be said that we got off relatively lightly in terms of the increase in price of materials. This effect is thanks to our effective countermeasures, namely the list price increases. Obviously, they have, in principle, been aggressive enough. Let us further talk about the personnel expenses. If more service revenues is generated, personnel expenses should actually increase disproportionately because service sales are much more personnel intensive. In absolute terms, personnel expenses increased by 7.6 million euros, which is equal to 15%. But in relation to output, the personnel ratio falls to 16.8% now. Sure, we have more personnel costs that also come from the Senatec Center Schweinfurt, Germany, and, at least for the months January to May, also for HJS that has only been fully consolidated since May 2021. But even if you ignore these two small special effects, you can say the company, meaning 2G as a whole, simply purchased, produced, invoiced, etc. more than ever before, without increasing the number of employees accordingly. This effect also applies to operating expenses. They are increasing, especially because sales commissions for foreign countries are rising sharply. And of course, the additional service business also leads to significantly higher vehicle costs, not to mention diesel costs. And even it's only of small change, the first-time consolidation of the operating expenses of Senatec Center Schweinfurt also added another 250k euros. But all of that increases less than the overall output increases. There's also a few positive special effects, or rather, in the previous year, we had negative special effects that did not repeat it again. Briefly mentioned, the write-offs on receivables in Ukraine and Russia, and the legal and consulting cost for the small capital increase at the beginning of 2021, and the small M&A activities during the year. All this didn't occur again in 2022, so that we ultimately arrive at an EBIT of 22 million euros instead of 17.9 million euros in the previous years. The EBIT margin thus reached almost exactly 7%, a margin that you might expect it to be higher at one time. However, we are happy with this margin because we have been worried about this again and again during the year due to the enormous material price increases. In addition, please keep in mind, we are not just looking at a more or less one-off growth spurt. After all, we still expect to build and sell up to 390 million euros by the end of next year. And after 2024, I'm not giving away any secret here. We want to continue to grow organically and purely in terms of volume by 10% per year. But one thing is clear, we must continue to build the structures for this growth. And that's not just the new ERP landscape we are rolling out. Other things come along as well, but they all have the unpleasant similarity that they first cost, sometimes even a lot. But in our view, these investments are necessary today so that healthy structural growth is also possible beyond the 390 million euros and so from 2025 onwards. Let us now take a look at operating working capital. This has in fact increased by a massive 31% to now 94.5 million euros. Where did the additional 22.2 million euros come from? Quite obviously, they come mainly from the unfinished products, which are in fact mostly almost finished CHP. This line is increasing by 25.7 million euros. The small difference of slightly more than 250k euros compared to the income statement can be explained by currency differences, as the income statement is not set up according to the closing rates, but according to the average rates of the year 2022. As I said, this increase is more or less a down payment on a good first quarter. Raw materials and supplies increases by 25%, but are very slightly below the increase in factory output, which was 26%. Unfortunately, we have not come any closer to reducing turnaround times, but even as a controller with industrial background, I have to admit, a forward-looking purchasing policy that takes into account the enormous price jumps on the procurement market does not go particularly well with the optimization of stock turnover. Our priorities were different this year. In addition, the specific advance payments received are also increased by actually 10.2 million euros. In other words, except from a remaining amount of 3.1 million euros, the additional raw materials have been pre-financed by customers. And the suppliers carry even more than the rest. This is because trade accounts payables increased by 9 million euros. Overall, the inventories increased by 30.4 million euros, from which, however, the finished CHP of 25.7 million euros actually would have to be deducted. Let's go further to the receivables. They got up by 32%, so more than the sales increase. But that's because Q4 was strong in terms of sales. The receivables incurred in Q4 have not yet all fallen due and have therefore not been collected yet. Then there are advance payments without specific reference to orders that are in principle quite to a large extent the saving installments paid by customers resulting from the full maintenance contracts. These are up 41%, which is higher than service revenues. But linking current service revenues to current saving rates or current service installments is not actually allowed in my eyes. This is because today's sales are based on a saving rate of past periods. However, the increased saving rates show very nicely that it has been possible to conclude further full maintenance contracts. Thus, the service business remains a nice business that, if it runs properly, will continue to provide secure cash flows in the future. In summary, operating working capital is rising without us having to worry about it. We are quite pleased with the development, knowing that the CHP that are ready for connections will now actually be converted into sales in Q1 or latest Q2. I would now like to turn to the development of liquidity. This overview is not identical with the cash flow statement in the annual report. This is because the initial consolidation of companies, in our case Senatec Center Schweinfurt in Germany, makes the cash flow statement more difficult to read. That's why I would like to show here a more, let's say, traditional layout. First, you can see the cash inflow from EBIT at 22 million euros. Please note again, our EBIT no longer includes income from the release of the UK provision. As already mentioned, we've taken it out of the EBIT calculation. Back to the cash flow statement, the EBIT is adjusted by depreciations and amortizations of 4.7 million euros. Then you can see the cash outflow by the rising operating working capital. Furthermore, there is the adjustment for the change in provision included in EBIT, which is purely operational and will be calculated with an amount of 2.5 million euros. After that, there's an adjustment for other changes in the balance sheet, which had increased instead of decreased simply due to circumstances by 4.3 million euros. Last, there was a cash outflow of 6.3 million euros, which represents our income tax burden. This results in an operating cash flow of 5 million euros, which is nevertheless very close to the previous year's level, despite a substantial increase in working capital. So what did we do with this operating cash flow? We have invested heavily, almost 10 million euros. Among other things, we invested in land in Heek, Germany, where we bought a plot of land about 5,000 square meters that is directly connected to our factory site. In addition, we bought another plot of land in the industrial park here in Heek, about 17,000 square meters. This plot isn't directly connected to the existing plant, but is still a very good reserve. For both plots together, we spent about 4 million euros. In addition, there was the acquisition of the new subsidiary, Senatec Center, Schweinfurt, and the remaining 4 million euros were invested in tools, vehicles, hardware, software, and so on. License for the new AP program alone cost us now €500,000. All in all, however, the investment activities aren't really extraordinary. The prior year's figures were unusually low as they included revenues for the sales of the commercial property in the USA. Without these revenues, the previous year's figures in cash flow from investing activities would also have amounted to approximately 5 million euros. Next, I wanted to mention the impact of the financing activities on the cash flow. 2021 was strongly influenced by the small capital increase and thus show a positive saldo on the statement. In the past year, 2022, there only were, I call it, normal transaction, namely the dividend payment with an amount of 2.2 million euros, the payment of further interest with an amount of 0.4 million euros. Both payments were at last year's level. And last, the deposit from financial loans with an amount of 1 million euros. All in all, this results in cash and cash equivalent of 13.3 million euros, which is still very comfortable. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I wanted to say about the annual figures of the past financial years. What can we expect for the year 2023, which has already begun? We have initially forecast a top line that is represented by a turnover of 310 to 350 million euros. If we take the mean value of this forecast, purely arithmetically, we obtain 330 million euros. If we divide these 330 million euros very carefully because it's not meant to be a narrowing of the forecast, but simply an arithmetical approximation, into 45% service sales and 55% machine sales. And if you then put the order backlog at the start of the year next to it, then you can see that at 177 million euros, we already have an order situation that makes us extremely confident about the 2023 growth target. With an order backlog of 177 million euros, we can surely achieve a machine sales figure of 182 million euros, especially as we think about the current corona issues and availability issues that have definitely influenced us in the last year. These are the reasons why our thoughts about reaching the top line forecast are very optimistic. With more caution, we have to look at the bottom line. As already mentioned before, the topic of material price increases has not returned to normal yet. Sanctions and counter-sanctions could well hit us, although we have to say that sanctions have not been our main problem so far. However, the geopolitical situation on the one hand and the somewhat potential banking crisis on the other hand make it advisable for us to enter the forecast with a rather wide corridor for 2023 as well, so similar to 2022. So we decided to set the range of EBIT margin on 6.5 to 8.5%. So the mean average for sales and EBIT would be 330 million euros turnover in top line and 25 million euros EBIT in bottom line. If we now take a look into the future, I need to say there is an older forecast which we presented last year and which shows our ideas for 2026, at least from last year's point of view. We forecasted that sales would rise to 400 million euros and that EBIT margin would be in the range of 8.5 to 10%. We have not officially retreated this forecast, but we have effectively replaced it by now forecasting that we should be up to 390 million euros and this already by next year. And that we are also already generating the 8.5 to 10% EBIT margin next year. With the mean average of the upper forecast 2023 and the upper forecast 2024, we will see the following figures. In fact, we see that we are about 2 years ahead from our older forecast. Until 2026, the only thing left to do would be to increase turnover very, very moderately, but just under 5% per year. From today's perspective, a ridiculous small growth rate. But until we don't understand a little bit better what is likely to happen with inflation, we find it difficult, honestly, to make a forecast beyond the next 2 years. So I can only repeat here, we want to grow by about 10% per year in terms of volume, also in further upcoming years. Coming to the end, we believe that the structural situation in Europe and America will continue to improve, even already this year. Huge growth potentials lay ahead of us. Thank you for your attention and your interest on 2G Energy. Take care.